Marcus Thompson had always been trouble, standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl etched across his face. He carried himself like someone who owned every room he entered. At 25, Marcus had already built a reputation in his small English town of Whitmore as the guy you didn't want to cross. His knuckles bore the scars of countless fights, and his cold blue eyes seemed to challenge anyone who dared look his way. The local pub owners knew his name, not because they welcomed him, but because they dreaded seeing him walk through their doors. Marcus had a talent for finding trouble, or perhaps trouble had a talent for finding him. Either way, the result was always the same: broken furniture, bruised faces, and police reports that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Whitmore, Marcus learned early that strength was the only currency that mattered. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was just 8 years old, leaving behind a bitter mother and 3 younger siblings. Marcus quickly became the man of the house, but not in the way most people would hope. He used his fists to solve problems and his intimidating presence to get what he wanted. By the time he reached his teenage years, Marcus had been suspended from school more times than he could count. Teachers whispered about him in the staff room, warning newcomers about the Thompson boy and his explosive temper. He dropped out at 16, much to everyone's relief, and spent his days wandering the streets, looking for ways to make money and assert his dominance over anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. The local police knew Marcus well. Sergeant Williams had arrested him at least a dozen times for various offenses: bar fights, petty theft, vandalism, and disturbing the peace. Each time, Marcus would spend a night or two in lockup, pay a fine, and be back on the streets within days. He seemed to view these encounters with law enforcement as minor inconveniences rather than serious consequences for his actions. Marcus lived in a cramped apartment above Mrs. Henderson's bakery on Mill Street. The elderly woman had been kind enough to rent to him when no one else would, though she often regretted that decision when she heard the shouting and crashing from upstairs during his frequent parties. The apartment was sparsely furnished. A worn couch, a small television, and a mattress on the floor served as his home. Empty beer bottles and takeaway containers littered every surface, creating an atmosphere of neglect and carelessness. His daily routine was predictable and destructive. Marcus would wake up around noon, usually nursing a hangover from the previous night's drinking session. He'd stumble to the corner shop to buy cigarettes and energy drinks, intimidating the young cashiers with his mere presence. The shop owner, Mr. Patel, had considered banning Marcus multiple times but feared the repercussions of such a decision. Afternoons were spent in the local park, where Marcus would gather with other troublemakers from the area. They'd drink cheap cider, smoke cigarettes, and plan their next schemes. These weren't elaborate criminal enterprises, mostly small-time hustles like selling stolen goods or running illegal gambling games behind the community center. Marcus was always the leader of these groups, using his reputation and physical presence to maintain control over the others. The evenings were when Marcus truly came alive. He'd make his rounds to the local pubs, starting fights with anyone who looked at him wrong or simply because he was bored. The Swan and Crown had banned him permanently after he threw a chair through their front window during an argument over a football match. The King's Head still allowed him entry, but only because the owner was too scared to refuse him service. Marcus had a particular hatred for authority figures. Police officers, security guards, traffic wardens, anyone in a uniform was an automatic target for his aggression. He saw them as representatives of a system that had failed him and his family, and he took every opportunity to express his contempt for what they represented. This attitude had led to numerous additional charges over the years, as his disrespect for law enforcement often escalated minor situations into major incidents. His relationship with his family had deteriorated over the years. His mother, Sarah, still lived in the same council house where Marcus had grown up, but she rarely spoke to her eldest son anymore. His younger siblings had learned to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him coming. They were embarrassed by his reputation and tired of being associated with his constant troubles. Despite his fearsome reputation, Marcus wasn't particularly intelligent when it came to planning his activities. He was impulsive and reactive, responding to situations with his fists first and thinking about consequences later. This approach had served him well in establishing his dominance over the local troublemakers. But it also meant that he frequently found himself in situations that could have been avoided with a little forethought. The local council had tried various intervention programs with Marcus over the years. Social workers had attempted to help him find legitimate employment. Counselors had tried to address his anger issues, and community leaders had offered him opportunities to channel his energy into more positive pursuits. Marcus had rejected all of these efforts, viewing them as attempts to control him or make him weak. His criminal record was extensive but consisted mainly of minor offenses. Despite his violent reputation, Marcus had never seriously injured anyone or committed any major crimes. He was a bully and a troublemaker, but he wasn't a career criminal in the traditional sense. This distinction would prove important later, as it meant that despite his many encounters with the law, he had never faced truly serious consequences for his actions. Marcus had few genuine friends, only associates who tolerated his presence because they feared the alternative. He was lonely, though he would never admit it, and his aggressive behavior was partly a defense mechanism designed to keep people at a distance before they could reject or abandon him. This psychological aspect of his personality made him particularly dangerous, as he was always looking for ways to prove his strength and dominance to himself as much as to others. The town of Whitmore itself was a typical English market town with a population of about 15,000 people. It had a historic center with medieval buildings, a weekly market, and the usual collection of shops, pubs, and restaurants that characterized small English towns. The community was tight-knit, and Marcus's reputation was well known to virtually every resident. He was seen as a local problem that everyone hoped would eventually sort itself out or simply go away. Local businesses had developed various strategies for dealing with Marcus. Some chose to serve him quickly and hope he would leave without incident. Others had installed security cameras and panic buttons to summon help if needed. The more upscale establishments in the town center had hired security guards specifically to keep him out. This created a sort of informal map of the town, with certain areas being Marcus-friendly and others being off-limits to him. The irony of Marcus's situation was that despite his tough guy image, he was actually quite insecure and desperately seeking respect and recognition. He had never learned healthy ways to gain these things, so he resorted to fear and intimidation as substitutes. This approach had worked in his limited environment, but it also trapped him in a cycle of violence and isolation that seemed impossible to break. As spring turned to summer in 2019, Marcus was facing increasing pressure from various sources. The police were keeping a closer eye on him following a particularly violent incident at a local football match. His landlady was threatening eviction due to noise complaints from other tenants. His benefits were being reviewed, and there was a possibility that his payments might be reduced or stopped entirely. These pressures were building to a breaking point, and those who knew Marcus could sense that something significant was about to happen. He was drinking more heavily than usual, and his temper was even shorter than normal. The local police had even discussed the possibility of taking preventive action, though they weren't sure what form that might take given that Marcus hadn't actually committed any serious crimes recently. It was against this backdrop of mounting tension and frustration that Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He had heard about a special event taking place in London, a ceremony involving members of the royal family that would be heavily guarded by the elite royal guards. To Marcus, these guards represented everything he despised about authority and the establishment. They were symbols of a system that he felt had rejected and failed him. The idea began to form in Marcus's mind slowly at first, then, with increasing clarity and determination. He would go to London and show these fancy guards what a real man looked like. He would prove that their uniforms and ceremony meant nothing when faced with someone who wasn't afraid to fight. In his twisted logic, confronting a royal guard would be the ultimate demonstration of his strength and fearlessness. Marcus had no real plan beyond the basic idea of starting trouble with the royal guards. He didn't consider the legal consequences, the security measures that would be in place, or the training and capabilities of the guards themselves. He simply saw an opportunity to make a statement and assert his dominance in the most dramatic way possible. The decision to target the royal guards wasn't entirely random. Marcus had grown up hearing stories about how these soldiers were just for show, ceremonial figures who looked impressive but couldn't actually fight. He dismissed their military training and professional capabilities, seeing them only as symbols of an establishment that he wanted to challenge. This fundamental misunderstanding of what royal guards actually were would prove to be a critical error in his thinking. As he began to make preparations for his trip to London, Marcus felt a surge of excitement and anticipation. This would be his moment to show everyone in Whitmore what he was really capable of. He imagined returning home as a local legend, the man who had stood up to the royal guards and lived to tell about it. These fantasies fueled his determination and blinded him to the reality of what he was planning to attempt. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the difference between a small-town bully and a professionally trained soldier. Marcus Thompson was about to learn that there were consequences in the world far beyond anything he had ever experienced in his limited environment. His journey from Whitmore to London would mark the beginning of the most important lesson of his life, though it would be taught in a way he could never have anticipated. Guard James Mitchell stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, his red tunic immaculate, and his black bearskin hat perfectly positioned. To tourists and passers-by, he appeared to be simply a ceremonial figure, a living piece of British tradition standing motionless in the London sunshine. They had no idea they were looking at one of Britain's most elite soldiers, a man who had earned his position through years of rigorous training and combat experience. At 28 years old, James had already served 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq as part of the Grenadier Guards. His chest bore the ribbons of multiple service medals, though these were hidden beneath his ceremonial uniform. The tourists taking photos had no idea that this seemingly statue-like figure had survived improvised explosive devices, engaged in firefights with insurgents, and saved the lives of fellow soldiers under the most extreme conditions imaginable. James had grown up in a military family in Yorkshire. His father had served in the Royal Marines, and his grandfather had fought in World War II. Military service wasn't just a career choice for James. It was a family tradition that stretched back generations. From an early age, he had known that he wanted to follow in their footsteps and serve his country with distinction. The selection process for the Royal Guards was notoriously difficult. Only the best soldiers from the finest regiments were even considered for the role. James had excelled in every aspect of his training, demonstrating not only physical prowess but also the mental discipline and emotional control required to serve in such a visible and demanding position. He could stand at attention for hours without moving, ignore harassment from tourists, and maintain his composure under any circumstances. Behind his stoic exterior, James was constantly alert and aware of his surroundings. His eyes, though seemingly fixed straight ahead, were actually scanning the crowd for potential threats. His training had taught him to assess every individual who came near him, categorizing them as harmless tourists, potential pickpockets, or genuine security threats. This wasn't paranoia, it was professional vigilance honed through years of experience in dangerous environments. The physical demands of guard duty were often underestimated by observers. The uniforms were heavy and hot, weighing nearly 40 pounds including the bearskin hat. Standing motionless for extended periods required tremendous physical conditioning and mental fortitude. James's body had been conditioned through years of military training to endure these challenges without showing any sign of discomfort or fatigue. James's route to becoming a Royal Guard had begun in basic training at Catterick Garrison, where he had immediately distinguished himself as an exceptional recruit. His instructors noted his natural leadership abilities, his unwavering attention to detail, and his ability to perform under pressure. These qualities had led to his selection for advanced infantry training and eventually to his assignment with the Grenadier Guards. His first tour in Afghanistan had been a brutal introduction to modern warfare. James had experienced the fear of roadside bombs, the chaos of urban combat, and the responsibility of keeping his fellow soldiers alive in an environment where death could come from any direction at any moment. These experiences had forged him into a soldier who could remain calm and effective under the most extreme pressure imaginable. During his second deployment, James had earned a commendation for bravery after he had crawled through enemy fire to rescue a wounded comrade who was trapped in a damaged vehicle. The incident had lasted several hours, with James providing medical aid while under constant threat from insurgent snipers. His actions had saved his fellow soldier's life and demonstrated the kind of courage and selflessness that defined the best military personnel. Between deployments, James had undergone extensive additional training in close protection, crowd control, and emergency response procedures. He was qualified in multiple weapons systems, trained in hand-to-hand combat, and certified in advanced first aid. His superiors had identified him as potential officer material, and he had been fast-tracked for specialized assignments that would test his abilities under diverse circumstances. The transition to ceremonial duties had required a different kind of training. James had to learn the intricate protocols of royal ceremonies, master the art of remaining motionless for extended periods, and develop the ability to ignore provocation from tourists and protesters. This psychological training was just as demanding as any physical challenge he had faced in combat, requiring a different kind of mental toughness and self-control. James took great pride in his role as a royal guard. He understood that he wasn't just protecting the royal family. He was representing centuries of British military tradition and excellence. Every day he stood guard. He was upholding the reputation of his regiment and his country. This sense of duty and honor motivated him to maintain the highest standards of performance, regardless of the circumstances. The tourists who gathered around the guards often tried to make them break character, taking selfies and making jokes at their expense. James had learned to tune out these distractions while remaining alert to genuine threats. He could distinguish between harmless fun-seeking tourists and individuals who might pose a real danger. His training had taught him to assess body language, behavior patterns, and potential weapons with split-second accuracy. On the morning that would change everything, James was assigned to sentry duty at the main gate of Buckingham Palace. It was a busy day with hundreds of tourists streaming past his position, cameras clicking constantly as visitors from around the world captured photos of the iconic scene. The weather was pleasant, and the crowds were larger than usual, creating a festive atmosphere that masked the serious security operation taking place behind the scenes. James's routine began at dawn with a thorough equipment inspection. Every button on his uniform was checked, every piece of equipment was verified, and his rifle was meticulously cleaned and inspected. The standards for royal guards were absolute. There was no margin for error in appearance or equipment. A single loose thread or tarnished button could result in disciplinary action and removal from ceremonial duties. The morning briefing had covered the day's schedule, weather conditions, and any special security concerns. Intelligence officers had reported no specific threats, but they emphasized the need for constant vigilance given the high-profile nature of the location. James and his fellow guards were reminded of the protocols for handling various types of incidents, from medical emergencies to security breaches. As James took his position, he mentally reviewed the emergency procedures he might need to implement. He knew the location of every security camera, every emergency alarm, and every escape route in the immediate area. His radio was concealed beneath his uniform, allowing him to communicate with the security control room without breaking character. His rifle, while appearing ceremonial to tourists, was fully functional and loaded with live ammunition. The morning passed uneventfully with the usual parade of tourists and their cameras. James maintained his rigid posture while constantly monitoring the crowd for anything unusual. He had learned to recognize the difference between excited tourists and individuals who might be conducting surveillance or planning something harmful. His years of experience in high-threat environments had given him an almost supernatural ability to sense when something wasn't right. Around midday, James noticed an increase in activity from the plainclothes security officers who mingled with the tourists. Their movements suggested they were tracking someone or monitoring a developing situation. James remained in position but heightened his alertness, preparing for whatever might be coming his way. He had no way of knowing that Marcus Thompson was making his way through the London crowds, driven by anger and a dangerous misunderstanding of what he was about to encounter. The security team had been monitoring Marcus since he arrived in London. His aggressive behavior on the train, his confrontational attitude with station staff, and his obvious focus on the palace had marked him as a potential problem. Security cameras had tracked his movement through the city, and officers had observed him drinking in several pubs near the palace, each drink making him more belligerent and less rational. James's training had taught him that the most dangerous individuals were often those who appeared unremarkable at first glance. The real threats rarely announced themselves with obvious weapons or threatening behavior. Instead, they blended into crowds, studied their targets, and struck when guards might be complacent. This knowledge kept him constantly alert, even during seemingly routine ceremonial duties. The support systems around James were extensive and sophisticated. The Metropolitan Police maintained a heavy but discreet presence around the palace, with armed officers positioned at key points throughout the area. CCTV cameras provided comprehensive coverage of every approach to the building, and computer systems continuously analyzed the footage for suspicious behavior or potential threats. Behind the scenes, intelligence analysts were monitoring communications intercepts, social media posts, and travel records for any indication of planned attacks or security threats. The security operation around the royal family was one of the most comprehensive in the world, involving multiple agencies and thousands of personnel working around the clock to maintain safety and security. James had been briefed on the various types of individuals who might try to breach palace security. These ranged from mentally ill people seeking attention to organized terrorists planning sophisticated attacks. Each category required different response protocols, and guards were trained to make rapid assessments and respond accordingly. The key was to neutralize threats quickly while minimizing harm to innocent bystanders. As the afternoon wore on, James could sense a change in the atmosphere around the palace. The security officers were more active, their communication more frequent, and their positioning more strategic. Something was building, and James prepared himself mentally for whatever might come. His training had taught him that the transition from routine to emergency could happen in seconds, and he needed to be ready to act decisively when that moment arrived. The crowd of tourists remained oblivious to the increased security activity. They continued taking photos, chatting excitedly, and enjoying their London sightseeing experience. James envied their innocence in some ways. The ability to enjoy the pageantry without constantly scanning for threats or calculating response times to various emergency scenarios. Marcus Thompson was getting closer with each passing minute, his anger growing with every step. The alcohol he had consumed was clouding his judgment and amplifying his natural aggression. He saw the palace guards not as professional soldiers, but as symbols of everything he hated about authority and the establishment. His plan, such as it was, involved confronting one of these guards and showing the world that they weren't as tough as they appeared. James had no way of knowing the specific nature of the threat approaching him, but his instincts and training told him that something significant was about to happen. He remained motionless in his ceremonial position while mentally preparing for action. Years of military experience had taught him to trust his intuition, and every fiber of his being was telling him that danger was approaching. The stage was set for a confrontation between two very different men from very different worlds. Marcus Thompson, a small-town bully fueled by alcohol and anger, was about to discover that the ceremonial guards he had dismissed as powerless symbols were actually some of Britain's most highly trained and capable soldiers. The lesson he was about to receive would be swift, decisive, and unforgettable. The London afternoon sun beat down on the crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace as Marcus Thompson stumbled through the sea of tourists, his vision slightly blurred from the 4 pints he had consumed at 3 different pubs during his journey across the city. His cheap sneakers made wet slapping sounds against the pavement where someone had spilled a drink, and his wrinkled shirt clung to his sweating back. The grandeur of the palace meant nothing to him. He saw only targets in red uniforms standing like mannequins, begging to be knocked down a peg. Marcus pushed past a family taking photos, causing the father to drop his camera with a sharp crack against the concrete. When the man turned to protest, Marcus's cold stare and imposing physical presence quickly changed his mind. The family hurried away, clutching their young children closer as they disappeared into the crowd. This small display of dominance fed Marcus's ego and reinforced his belief that intimidation was the key to getting respect. The security cameras had been tracking Marcus's erratic movement through the crowd for the past 20 minutes. In the underground control room, Sergeant Davies watched multiple screens showing different angles of the approaching threat. Marcus's body language screamed aggression, His clenched fists, aggressive stride, and constant scanning of the guards' positions made it clear he wasn't just another curious tourist. Davies quietly alerted his team and began positioning additional officers in strategic locations around the palace perimeter. Marcus finally focused on his target, guard James Mitchell, standing at rigid attention near the main gate. To Marcus, James looked like every authority figure he had ever resented, every symbol of the system that had failed him. The red uniform, the tall black hat, the perfect posture, it all represented wealth and privilege that Marcus felt had been denied to him throughout his difficult life. The alcohol in his system turned his resentment into burning rage. James, still maintaining his ceremonial position, had already identified Marcus as a potential threat through his peripheral vision. The man's aggressive body language, unsteady gait, and obvious focus on the guards triggered every alarm bell in James's trained mind. He could smell the alcohol from several feet away and recognized the dangerous combination of intoxication and aggression that he had encountered numerous times during his military service. The crowd around the palace gates was thick with tourists from dozens of countries, all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly couples pointed and whispered about the history they were witnessing, and teenage tourists posed for selfies with the guards in the background. None of them realized they were about to witness something far more dramatic than any ceremonial display. Marcus began shouting as he approached James's position, his words slurred, but his intention crystal clear. "Look at you standing there like a bloody statue," he bellowed, causing nearby tourists to turn and stare. "Think you're something special in that fancy costume, do you? I'll show you what a real man looks like when he's not hiding behind a uniform and a silly hat." The tourists closest to Marcus began backing away as his voice grew louder and more threatening. Parents grabbed their children and moved them to safer positions, while others fumbled for their phones to record what was clearly going to be an unusual incident. The festive atmosphere around the palace gates quickly shifted to one of tension and uncertainty as people realized they might be witnessing something dangerous. James remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, but every muscle in his body was coiled and ready for action. His military training had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond with precisely the amount of force necessary to neutralize them. He could see from Marcus's stance and movement that the man had some experience with fighting, but it was clearly the brutal, undisciplined brawling of the streets rather than any formal training. Marcus moved closer, now standing directly in front of James and shouting directly into his face. The alcohol on his breath was overwhelming, and spittle flew from his mouth as he continued his verbal assault. "What's wrong with you? Can't you hear me talking to you? Or are you too good to talk to regular people like me? I bet you've never been in a real fight in your life. Have you, pretty boy?" The security team was moving into position around the perimeter, but they held back on direct intervention, knowing that James was more than capable of handling the situation himself. Their primary concern was ensuring that innocent bystanders remained safe, and that any escalation was contained quickly. Additional officers had quietly cleared evacuation routes and were prepared to move tourists to safety if necessary. James's training and ceremonial duties required him to ignore verbal provocation and maintain his position regardless of harassment from tourists or protesters. However, his combat experience told him that Marcus was building up to physical violence, and he needed to be ready to respond accordingly. The key was to wait until Marcus actually committed to an attack before taking action. Anything earlier could be seen as an unprovoked assault by an aggressive soldier. Marcus interpreted James's silence as weakness rather than the professional restraint it actually represented. In Marcus's limited experience, people who didn't respond to his intimidation were either scared or weak, and he had never encountered someone with the kind of discipline and training that James possessed. This fundamental misreading of the situation was about to cost him dearly. "I'm talking to you," Marcus screamed, now close enough that his face was only inches from James's. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, you arrogant bastard. You think that uniform makes you better than me? I'll show you what happens when you disrespect someone who's not afraid to fight back." The crowd had formed a wide circle around the confrontation, with some tourists recording the incident on their phones while others simply stared in shocked fascination. Many had never seen anything like this before, a clearly disturbed individual directly confronting one of the famous royal guards. They had no idea what the proper protocol was for such situations or how dangerous the situation might become. Marcus raised his fist and drew back his arm, telegraphing his intention to throw a punch. This was the moment James had been waiting for, the point where Marcus's behavior crossed from verbal harassment into physical assault. The split second before Marcus committed to his attack, James's training kicked in with devastating efficiency. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the tourists didn't fully understand what they had witnessed until they watched their phone recordings later. As Marcus's fist moved toward James's face, the guard's head moved slightly to the left, causing the punch to whistle harmlessly past his ear. Simultaneously, James's right hand shot out in a precise strike that caught Marcus directly in the solar plexus, driving all the air from his lungs and doubling him over in agony. The counterattack was executed with surgical precision, using exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat without causing permanent injury. James's military training had taught him dozens of ways to disable an opponent quickly and efficiently, and he had chosen a technique that would end the confrontation immediately while minimizing harm to his attacker. Marcus collapsed to his knees, gasping for air and clutching his stomach. The punch he had thrown with such confidence had connected with nothing but air, while the response he received had been swift, accurate, and completely overwhelming. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself completely helpless and at the mercy of someone he had tried to intimidate. James immediately returned to his ceremonial position, his expression never changing and his breathing completely normal. To the watching tourists, it appeared as though he had barely moved at all. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 seconds from the time Marcus threw his punch to the moment he hit the ground, and James had handled it with the kind of cool professionalism that only comes from years of experience in dangerous situations. The security officers moved in quickly to apprehend Marcus, who was still struggling to breathe and completely unable to resist. They had observed the entire incident and confirmed that James had acted in self-defense against a clear assault. Marcus was handcuffed while still on his knees, his earlier bravado replaced by complete submission and humiliation. The crowd of tourists erupted in a mixture of cheers and applause, though many were still processing what they had just witnessed. The speed and efficiency of James's response had been so impressive that some observers weren't sure exactly what had happened. They had expected to see either a brutal fight or a helpless soldier being assaulted by a civilian, but instead they had witnessed a masterclass in professional restraint and precise self-defense. Marcus was slowly helped to his feet by the security officers, his face red with embarrassment and his body still trembling from the impact of James's strike. The reality of his situation was beginning to penetrate through the fog of alcohol and adrenaline. He had traveled to London planning to humiliate a royal guard, and instead found himself handcuffed and struggling to breathe after being effortlessly defeated by someone who hadn't even broken character during the confrontation. As Marcus was led away by the Metropolitan Police, he caught one last glimpse of James standing at perfect attention, showing no sign that anything unusual had just occurred. The guard's professionalism and composure in the face of a direct assault made Marcus's own behavior look even more pathetic and juvenile by comparison. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more stark, one representing discipline, training, and service, the other representing ignorance, aggression, and self-destruction. The tourists gradually dispersed, many of them calling friends and family to describe what they had just witnessed. The incident would be posted on social media within minutes, shared thousands of times, and become a viral sensation demonstrating the difference between trained professionals and street bullies. For James, it had been just another day at work, but for Marcus, it marked the beginning of the most humiliating and educational experience of his life. The Metropolitan Police van that would take Marcus away from the palace was already pulling up to the scene, its officers prepared to process another individual who had learned too late that the royal guards were far more than ceremonial figures. Marcus's journey from small-town bully to viral video star was about to take its most dramatic turn, and the consequences of his actions were only beginning to unfold. The fluorescent lights in the Metropolitan Police custody suite hummed overhead as Marcus Thompson sat on the hard plastic bench in his holding cell, still struggling to comprehend what had just happened to him. His ribs ached with every breath, a constant reminder of how quickly and decisively his confrontation with the Royal Guard had ended. The confidence and aggression that had carried him from Whitmore to London had evaporated completely, replaced by a growing sense of dread about what consequences awaited him. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh reviewed Marcus's file as she prepared for the interview. What she saw was a predictable pattern of escalating antisocial behavior, minor offenses, and missed opportunities for intervention. However, assaulting a Royal Guard elevated Marcus's case from routine local troublemaking to a serious offense that would likely result in significant prison time. The incident had been captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of tourists, making denial impossible. The viral video of Marcus's humiliating defeat had already spread across social media platforms worldwide. Within hours of the incident, millions of people had watched the footage of the small-town bully being effortlessly neutralized by the professional soldier. Comment sections filled with mockery and disbelief at Marcus's poor decision-making, while others praised guard James Mitchell's restraint and professionalism under pressure. Back in Whitmore, the video reached Marcus's hometown within hours of the incident. The local pub where Marcus had spent countless evenings intimidating other customers erupted in laughter as patrons watched their former tormentor being handcuffed while gasping for breath. For the first time in years, people in Whitmore felt safe discussing Marcus Thompson without fear of retaliation, as his reputation for invincibility had been utterly destroyed by 3 seconds of footage. Mrs. Henderson, Marcus's elderly landlady, watched the video on her granddaughter's phone with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had endured months of noise, property damage, and intimidation from her tenant, but seeing him humiliated on an international stage brought her no joy. Instead, she felt pity for a young man who had wasted his potential and destroyed his future through his own poor choices and violent behavior. Marcus's mother, Sarah, received the news from a neighbor who had seen the video online. She sat in her small kitchen, staring at the phone screen as her eldest son was repeatedly shown being defeated and arrested. The shame she felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with a strange sense of relief that Marcus had finally encountered someone who could match his aggression with superior skill and training. The legal process moved swiftly once Marcus sobered up and realized the gravity of his situation. His court-appointed lawyer, Jennifer Roberts, had handled hundreds of cases involving individuals who had made poor decisions while intoxicated, but Marcus's case was particularly challenging due to the high-profile nature of the incident and the clear video evidence of his assault on a Royal Guard. During their first meeting, Marcus sat across from his lawyer with his head in his hands, finally, understanding that his actions would have consequences far beyond anything he had previously experienced. The maximum sentence for assaulting a Royal Guard was 7 years in prison, and given the public nature of the incident and Marcus's existing criminal record, the prosecutor was seeking a substantial custodial sentence. Jennifer Roberts explained to Marcus that his best hope was to plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court. Any attempt to deny or minimize his actions would be futile given the overwhelming evidence against him. She also warned him that the media attention surrounding his case meant that he would likely become an example to deter others from similar behavior. The preliminary hearing was held at Westminster Magistrates Court, where Marcus faced charges of assault on a police officer, drunk and disorderly conduct, and causing alarm and distress. The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public who had come to see the viral video defendant in person. Marcus kept his head down throughout the proceedings, unable to meet the gaze of the people who had come to witness his humiliation. Magistrate David Thompson reviewed the evidence and deemed the case too serious for summary trial, referring it to Crown Court where Marcus would face a judge and jury. The magistrate also denied bail, citing Marcus's history of violence and the risk that he might commit further offenses if released. Marcus was remanded in custody at Wandsworth Prison to await his trial. Prison was a shock to Marcus's system in ways he had never anticipated. Despite his reputation as a tough guy in Whitmore, he discovered that actual criminals viewed him as a joke rather than a threat. The other inmates had all seen the viral video of his defeat, and they showed him no respect or fear. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself at the bottom of a social hierarchy rather than at the top. His cellmate, Danny Morrison, was serving time for armed robbery and had little patience for Marcus's self-pity. Danny had grown up in genuine poverty in Glasgow, survived gang warfare, and earned his reputation through real violence rather than bullying shopkeepers and intimidating teenagers. He viewed Marcus as a pathetic wannabe who had finally encountered real consequences for his actions. During his first week in prison, Marcus was forced to confront the reality that his behavior in Whitmore had been that of a big fish in a very small pond. Surrounded by career criminals, gang members, and individuals who had committed serious violent offenses, Marcus realized that his reputation as a local tough guy meant absolutely nothing in this environment. The other prisoners particularly enjoyed discussing the viral video of Marcus's defeat. They would replay it on smuggled phones during recreation time, laughing at how quickly and easily the Royal Guard had neutralized what they mockingly called the Whitmore Warrior. Marcus became the subject of constant jokes and ridicule, experiencing for the first time the kind of humiliation he had inflicted on others for years. Letters from home began arriving within days of Marcus's imprisonment, but not the kind of support he had hoped for. His younger siblings wrote to tell him how embarrassed they were by his actions and how relieved they were that he was finally facing consequences. His mother's letter was filled with disappointment and sadness, expressing her hope that prison might finally teach him the lessons that nothing else had been able to convey. The most surprising correspondence came from some of his former victims in Whitmore. Several people he had bullied and intimidated over the years wrote to express their satisfaction at seeing justice finally served. These letters detailed the fear and anxiety Marcus had caused in their lives, painting a picture of a community that had been terrorized by one individual's unchecked aggression. Guard James Mitchell, meanwhile, had returned to his duties with characteristic professionalism. He had submitted his incident report, cooperated with the investigation, and continued his ceremonial duties as though nothing had happened. The Metropolitan Police had commended his restraint and professional response to the assault, noting that he had used minimal force to neutralize the threat while maintaining his ceremonial role. The media attention surrounding the incident brought unwanted scrutiny to James's personal life, but he declined all interview requests and maintained his privacy. His commanding officers were pleased with how he had handled both the assault and the subsequent media interest, viewing it as further evidence of his exceptional professionalism and discretion. As Marcus's trial date approached, his lawyer worked to negotiate a plea deal that might reduce his sentence. However, the Crown Prosecution Service was determined to make an example of Marcus, believing that a strong sentence would deter others from similar behavior. The viral nature of the video meant that the case had international attention, and the authorities wanted to demonstrate that assaulting royal guards would result in severe consequences. Marcus spent his days in prison reflecting on the choices that had led him to this point. The isolation and humiliation he experienced gave him time to consider his behavior in ways he had never done before. For the first time, he began to understand how his actions had affected other people and how his reputation for violence had been built on intimidating those who were smaller, weaker, or more vulnerable than himself. The trial itself was a formality given the overwhelming evidence against Marcus. The jury took less than 30 minutes to find him guilty on all charges, and Judge Patricia Williams sentenced him to 4 years in prison with the possibility of parole after serving half his sentence. She noted that while Marcus's previous offenses had been relatively minor, his assault on a royal guard represented a serious escalation that required a substantial custodial sentence. As Marcus was led away to begin his sentence, he caught a glimpse of the packed courtroom gallery filled with people who had come to see his final humiliation. The viral video that had destroyed his reputation continued to circulate online, ensuring that his moment of defeat would be preserved forever as a cautionary tale about the consequences of bullying and violence. The news of Marcus's sentencing was received with satisfaction in Whitmore, where residents felt that justice had finally been served after years of intimidation and fear. Local business owners spoke openly about how Marcus's behavior had affected their community, and many expressed hope that his imprisonment would mark the beginning of a more peaceful period for their town. During his first months in prison, Marcus gradually began to understand the difference between real strength and the intimidation tactics he had relied on throughout his life. Watching other inmates who commanded genuine respect through intelligence, leadership, and earned authority, he began to see how hollow his own reputation had been. The viral video that had initially humiliated him eventually became a catalyst for self-reflection and the first steps toward genuine change. Guard James Mitchell continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, his brief encounter with Marcus Thompson becoming just another incident in a distinguished military career. He never sought recognition for his professional response to the assault, viewing it simply as part of his job. The viral video served as an excellent demonstration of the training and capability of the Royal Guards, showing the world that these soldiers were far more than ceremonial figures. Marcus Thompson's journey from small-town bully to viral video cautionary tale was complete, but his story was far from over. Prison would give him time to reflect, change, and hopefully emerge as a better person than the one who had drunkenly stumbled toward Buckingham Palace believing that intimidation and violence were signs of strength. The brutal payback he had received was swift and decisive, but the real consequences of his actions would take years to fully unfold.